Why are we having a presentation on education? What do the libertarians have to say about educating our children? So the Libertarian Platform, I'm going to read a couple sentences about what the National Libertarian Party has put together on our platform. Education is best provided by the free market, achieving greater quality, accountability, and efficiency with more diversity of choice. Recognizing that the education of children is a parental responsibility, we would restore authority to parents to determine the education of their children without the interference of government. Parents should have control and responsibility for all funds expended for their children's education. So the trend right now, and actually for the last couple of decades, but it's ramped up recently, is that the state is taking control and the responsibility away from the parents. Schools are moving towards surveillance of children. TUSD, Tucson Unified School District, as an example, is putting high-tech security systems into the schools now with this huge bond that they received. But they're also monetizing their data without parental consent and selling it without parental consent. This is not just happening here in Tucson. And then they're implementing policies and procedures that they see fit, not necessarily what is best for the children. And the parents don't get a choice in this a lot of times. So as a local example, in Arizona, we have the Arizona's Empowerment Scholarship Account, or ESA. I think many of you may have heard about that because it's been kind of controversial and in the news the last few years. So what it does is it allows parents to opt their children out of public, district, and charter schools and receive a portion of that public funding deposited into account that they can use towards stuff like private school tuition, online education, education therapies. Sounds great, right? Not so fast. So there's a lot of pros associated with ESA, and I will admit that. But there's a lot of other things you want to consider. The government is targeting the market that they couldn't reach before, the homeschoolers, the people who want to get out of this government system. You'll be signing a contract with the government, the parents will, and allowing them into your home. This is huge, and people don't understand that is what the ESA program is. And they sign bonds so that the parents are accountable and they can come after the parents. And there are limitations to the freedom of the ESA program. It's regulatory capture of education in our homeschool. This is why we want to present information on the school system, and Ken Richings is going to do a presentation on the history, and I want to introduce you to him. Ken Richings has been a teacher and tutor since 1996 to thousands of students ranging from ages 3 to 65 years old. Inside the school setting and outside in several states and other countries. In 2009, as a public school teacher in Chicago, he discovered the book, The Underground History of American Education, which encapsulated and articulated with historical evidence and personal experience what Ken had suspected since his first few weeks in the classroom. Ken's presentation takes its title from John Taylor Gatto's prior book, Dumbing Us Down, The Hidden Curriculum of Compulsory Schooling, and relies on other related works like The Deliberate Dumbing Down of American Education, How the Order Controls Education, and Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. All of which point to the central thesis that schooling is not what most people think it is. And as libertarians, hopefully this is not a surprise to you. I'm excited to introduce him and learn a lot from him. Ken?
Thank you, Tara. As Tara said, I've been a teacher for a while. Finding the work of John Taylor Gatto after I had been a public school teacher for 9 years just really hit home. He articulated so well with his gift of prose and gift of the gab what I had suspected since, as Tara said, the first few weeks of the classroom. This presentation I have renamed in the last couple weeks to include the parenthetical and history and future, and I should have said question mark, of compulsory schooling. This is really a work in progress. I'm not here to persuade you of anything. I hope that you get something of didactic interest. I think some of the history of schooling might be new to most, if not all of us. And most importantly, I'd like to encourage some kind of thinking, and hopefully we can have some kind of conversation or dialogue at the end of this presentation. I hope to be done in about 45 minutes or less. As Peter knows, among other people, it's easy to make a presentation that soon encapsulates hundreds of slides, and then you try to break it down into a few. So I'm going to try not to talk at length too much about much. Okay, my name is Ken Richings. I have a safe space here with libertarians. I think most of us who identify as libertarian are rather free-minded and are good kind of skeptics in the open-minded kind of way of the word. The ancient Athenian philosopher, who he was told that the Delphic oracle, the oracle at Delphi, was asked, who is the smartest man in the world? And the oracle said, Socrates. And when Socrates was informed of this, he said, well, that's interesting because I don't know anything. In fact, the only thing I know is that I don't really know anything. So maybe that makes me the smartest man in the world, because people think they know things and really they don't know anything. And I think I'm in that camp. And I might even be a little bit smarter than Socrates because I'm not even sure if I don't know anything. It's with that spirit that I try to engage you in this presentation. Sneak preview for the end of this presentation. Questions to consider. What's the future of not only schooling, but other means of controlling our lives, technologically, remotely? And from where might we take inspiration from any field of thought, and what to do? And I took a quote from this book, Anatomy of the State. It's from a much longer quote, but I'll just give you the bullet points that pertain to us. In the modern economy, money is the critical command post. The state always makes sure that it seizes and retains certain crucial command posts of the economy and society. Other command posts are a monopoly of violence, a monopoly of the ultimate judicial power, communication and transportation, and education to mold the opinions of its future citizens. And here's an image of John Taylor Gatto with his two most important books, I think. One is Dumbing Us Down. This was his first book. It was a series of essays that he wrote in the 80s and 90s. It's been updated for the 25th anniversary edition. I'm going to include some essays that were in this updated book. And the book that really got me in 2009 was The Underground History of American Education. He spent about, as he said, 8 years working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. It's a rather scholarly tome, I think. I have many people I've pulled information from. I just want to give reference to Alison McDowell. She has a blog called Wrench in the Gears. She's active on YouTube. Someone asked me the other day, well, Ken, what do you call research? And I said, well, someone like Alison McDowell, who is going to original source material. So she's going to white papers that are not widely broadcast or distributed. And she's going to the bibliography. And in the bibliography, she's then going to those papers and then those bibliographies. And that is someone who right now is in, she's forging a path of a language for what's coming. And she doesn't claim to know what's coming, which is part of what I really love about her. But she's forging a path to an articulation because, as Drew said to me recently, it's kind of like the end of the movie Apocalypto. And I hope I'm not spoiling this for anybody, but let's just forget I just said that. Just imagine the conquistadors coming to Central America, South America. And imagine you're one of these guys, you're an Aztec, and you're living in that primitive lifestyle, and suddenly you see these, at that point, modern military people show up in a ship, and you just have no language for what you're witnessing. Or if you're a black African in the heart of Africa, even in the 19th century, and the Belgian or whoever conquerors come in, you just have no language for what you're seeing. Allison is starting to forge that language, and that's part of the conversation I'd like to have towards the end of this presentation. I could have had a multi-hours long presentation filled with wonderful quotations. I'm going to try to limit the quotations. We'll give John Taylor Gatto a quote for sure, since this is based on his work. He wrote an essay called Against School. It's in this updated version of Dumbing Us Down. This quote comes from when he was on C-SPAN, and this was the very beginning of this interview, and the interviewer asked him, can you just sum up like, what's your basic theme? And he said off the top of his head, well, my basic theme, I suppose, would be that schools are dangerous places for kids. They retard intellectual development. They retard moral development. They bankrupt communities financially by bleeding hundreds of billions of dollars into unproductive activity. And they bleed communities dynamically by taking the energies of children away from the general society and dissipating them. They're places of intimidation, bullying, sexual harassment, criminality, and he went on and he got interrupted, and the interviewer said, well, we have a lot to unpack there. Let me ask you a question. Should schooling be compulsory? And he said schooling should not be compulsory. What is schooling? I have a quote from H.L. Mencken that I got from John Taylor Gatto, so I feel safe to quote it. And I looked for an image of H.L. Mencken, and if you know who he is, this might tickle your heart. One of the first links was from Snopes, and Snopes was doing a fact check. Did H.L. Mencken, did he really say the White House will be adorned by a downright moron? He did, and that should surprise no one. So with that in mind, you might not be shocked that this is what he had to say about education or schooling in 1924. The most erroneous assumption is that the aim of public education is to fill the young with knowledge and awaken their intelligence. Nothing could be further from the truth. The aim is simply to reduce as many individuals as possible to the same safe level, to breed and train a standardized citizenry, and to put down dissent and originality. That is its aim in the United States, and that is its aim everywhere else. So I have a question for you rhetorically. What does education mean to you? And why do schools exist? We have amazing historical antecedents. We're going to go back to the ancient Athenians for a moment. Aristotle, student of Plato, who was a student of Socrates, and the foundation of Western philosophy and the foundation of this nation goes back to these guys. Here's what Aristotle had to say in the Politics, one of his most famous works, I guess. And since the whole city, or state, back then this is what he meant by city, the city of Athens, and since the whole city has one end, it is manifest that education should be one and the same for everybody, and that it should be public and not private, not as it is at present, when everyone looks after his own children separately and gives them separate instruction of the sort which he thinks best. The training in things which are of common interest should be the same for all. We must not suppose that any one of the citizens belongs to himself, for they all belong to the state, and each of them are a part of the state, and the care of each part is inseparable from the care of the whole. In this case, the Lacedaemonians, or the Spartans, some of you might know who the Spartans were, they are to be praised, for they take the greatest pains about their children, and they make education the business of the state. Aristotle, and he's no Mencken. There was no hint of irony. He was very serious about this. So who were the Spartans? You may know about the famous Peloponnesian War. It was the first history of what we nowadays called history, a narrative about a magnificent war that took place, lasted for about 30 years. It was the Spartans versus the Athenians. Athens was the great city, flourishing music, philosophy, literature, the arts, and they had a strong navy. And the Spartans had a very militaristic, undemocratic state that was totally focused on warfare. And they, to my research, they were the first people that had a mandatory attendance. So there's a difference between mandatory schooling, where you provide school to people, and mandatory attendance. So this was mandatory attendance. They called it the agoge. And boys age 7 would start, and they'd be in this schooling, if you will, until about age 30. And then upon finishing, they became full citizens, which meant they got to get land and have a family. They were revered for this all the way up through the Prussians, which we're going to get to very soon, in the 18th century. What was new to me about this, some of you might appreciate this if you know anything about the Spartans, they broke up their education in age ranges. So from age 7 to 14, 15 to 19, 20 to 29, at which age they were eligible for military, which was the whole point of this. You're going to become a military man, and you're going to have your family over here on the side, but you're going to be in the military until you age out, like well into your dozens of years. But at the ages of 7 to 14, the boys were taught laconism. You might know this word, laconic. So they were taught laconism, the art of speaking in brief and witty phrases. Total antithesis to Athens, right? Socrates, Plato, Aristotle came from Athens. And as I said, in the Grand War that was narrated very brilliantly by Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, the Spartans won. We're going to fast forward about 2,000 years to the Aztecs. This is not the West, so most of my presentation has to do with the West. This was most of Gatto's research, and really from what little research and little reading, I should say, on the internet, it doesn't seem like there was any mandatory schooling like this or like the other people I'm talking about in what we might call the East or Middle East. So I'm going to make an exception from the West, and we're going to just mention the Aztecs briefly. So the Aztecs, modern day Mexico, boys and girls went to school from around age 15. So families were expected to provide some kind of education to the boys and girls until they were 15. And then from age 15, for some time, it's not exactly precisely certain, they were at school for a while, and there were two types of schooling. One type of schooling was for practical and military studies, what we might call the hoi polloi, if you will, to reference the Greeks. And the other type of schooling was advanced learning and writing, astronomy, statesmanship, theology, and leadership. Okay, back to the West and what we might call the Holy Roman Empire, etc. So by etc., I'm really meaning the English and the British Isles, as we might call them today. So from around 800, 800 was the year that Charlemagne was crowned king of the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne the Frank, which was a Germanic people, until the great reworking of Europe with Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, which is very critical to this presentation, especially regarding the Prussians, which is coming up very soon. So for about 1,000 years on the continent, we had most of the continent was part of the Holy Roman Empire. We had similar kind of schooling going on in the English Isles. Right there is a recreation of the palace at Aachen. Any history buffs, you might be interested. This was the palace of Charlemagne. We don't know exactly what it looked like, but this is allegedly a good representation. And it was at that school, the school of the palace, that he hired an Englishman, who I'm proud to say, being of English extraction myself, by the name of Alcuin, who allegedly revamped the education of the people going to these schools, which were not the hoi polloi, they were not the average ordinary person. These were people that were going to study for state service and religious studies. We're going to get off the mainland just ever so slightly. So almost all of what I'm presenting to you is material that I originally read about in Gatto. This was something that was new to me. In the 1700s and 1800s in Ireland, they had what's known as hedge schools. And the image on the left is an original hedge school. And on the right, you can barely see it, but if you look through the bushes, you can see some stones. These hedge schools were schools for Irish Catholics, which was most of the population, because in the late 1600s, the English made a law banning any schooling that was not Anglican. Anglican meaning the Church of England, going back to Henry VIII, when he wanted a divorce from one of his 8 wives and the Pope wouldn't do it. And Henry said, I'm going to start my own church. And he did, the Anglican Church. This gave me inspiration. So the Irish, if you don't know, the Irish were subjugated by the English for about 800 years. It's a little piece of history very few of us remember. Most people seem to equate the Irish and the English as one people. But I guarantee you, if you go to Ireland and talk to any of my ancestors, they're going to give you a tongue lashing. So I took some inspiration from these, and I wonder if that might be, inspiration for us going forward. Something I learned about in Gatto, the monitorial system, or what's sometimes called the Madras schools, named after a location in India, now called Chennai. Sometimes called the Lancaster schools, named after an Englishman with the last name Lancaster. So these were two guys that were very focused on helping the poor. And this was a time, late 1700s, 1800s, we're getting industrialization, we're getting poverty in big cities, and these were the students that were focused on in this system. The system originally came out of India at a orphan asylum, a military male orphan asylum in Madras. And Andrew Bell noticed that they had, for example, one 12-year-old in charge of 91 boys. And if you can see in this image, it's a big room with a lot of kids. And there are groups of kids being led by one slightly older kid, or maybe even the same age. And ideally, there is one adult. This picture shows several adults, so it doesn't give a true representation of what these schools really were operating like. But there's one adult that could oversee as many as more than 1,000 children who are each being taught by their peers, essentially. And of course, you're getting rudimentary education. I'm imagining basic arithmetic, basic reading. But back then, that would mean a lot to a lot of these people. And in fact, today we might say, well, if only we had pretty good skills in reading and math. Some of us probably have witnessed that a lot of our students, even in private schools, aren't necessarily getting that kind of education today. We're going to go back in time a little bit, come back over here, pre-stateside. So in 1647, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which had been founded less than 20 years prior, they already noticed that they were having a problem with the kids, right? That seems to be a theme throughout history. And a book I read recently, or skimmed recently, was specifically about the colonial times in New England. And he went to great length talking about the troublesome 60s and 70s. Where the kids were just not the same as what they used to be. And it wasn't the 1960s and 70s, it wasn't the 1860s, it wasn't the 70s, it was the 1660s and 70s, which if you put yourself in their shoes, just imagine coming across the Atlantic Ocean, setting up a colony de novo, and just trying to eke out an existence, let alone inculcate in your children collectively what is important to you as a small community, as a society, which to them, of course, was Christian, to say it most broadly, but Puritanism. This law in 1647 was known as the Old Deluder Satan Law. I'll just read the very beginning of that law. It being one chief project of that old deluder, Satan, to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures. And it goes on and on and on about the importance of our kids need to know how to read so they can read the Bible and not get deluded by Satan. So they mandated that townships or areas where there were 50 or more households had to some way come together, provide for one teacher somehow, you guys figure it out, and you're going to give instruction in reading to the kids of that community. So fast forward a little bit, we're going to go about 100 years in the future. This law was the Land Ordinance of 1785. We have had a few of those. And this was by the Congress of the Confederation. So this was before this nation was a nation, really, before we had our system of legislation. And this was rather important. So the key quote from this land ordinance was, "Religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and to the happiness of mankind, schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged." And how do they encourage this? Well, with this land ordinance that we're going to provide you land, right? They're going to provide it, however that happened. They provided land. And each township was set up in 36 square miles. And one of those square miles, section 16, was dedicated to some kind of public schooling. And it was up to that township how you're going to do it. But that land is yours. So that square mile would be yours. So that is the first national movement towards some kind of schooling. And I'll remind you, that was mandatory. Well, that wasn't mandatory schooling per se. That was the encouragement that you will do something in your township. So we're going to take this land that we're just finding over here where these other people used to live before we kicked them out. And we're going to give you this 36 square miles. And one of those square miles is going to be for education. You guys figure it out. Meanwhile, a couple decades before that, in 1763 in Prussia, and there's a map of what Prussia looked like around 1800. These were Germanic people. There never used to be a Germany until 1871. And so despite Germanic people being in history for a couple thousand years, Tacitus writes about them. And the Romans allegedly were somewhat envious of these Germanic people. You know, the people who eventually toppled, well, they invaded Rome. Whether they were singularly responsible for toppling the Roman Empire is a debate. But they were the first in 1,000 years to sack Rome. They came into the city, took it down. That led to the end of the Roman Empire. And 400 years later, we had the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire, something totally different. Not really. But these Germanic people were envied by the Romans because of their freedom. So we get the word libertarian from the word liberty. It's a Roman word, Latin word, freedom. But freedom within the context of a society. So this is liberty. Liberty is freedom within a state, for lack of a better way to put it. Freedom is a German word. It's a Germanic word, Freiheit auf Deutsch. And that refers to something much more primal. So the freedom of you being out in the woods or in the desert, all alone with coyotes and javelinas, and you figure it out. That's freedom. A lot of Romans were envious of the Germans because Romans didn't have that. Romans had liberty, but they didn't have the ability to have freedom unless they ventured out and just went into no man's land on their own. Germans had freedom, and the Germans, according to Tacitus, written more than 2,000 years ago, these Germanic people, very impressive with their warfare. They're always doing one or both of two things. They're making war and or drinking this fermented grain that we would call beer. And I think there's been a couple thousand years of continuity. I don't think the Germans would be offended. So this is a map of Prussia. Prussia wasn't German per se, and throughout the Holy Roman Empire, there was there's at one time around 1,000 different German independent states, and they could have been a small city, they could have been Prussia. But Prussia really was the military force. In 1763, mandatory attendance begins in Prussia by force and by punishment of negligent parents. So this law I'm reading from the 1790s, it is the duty of the inspectors to see that all children of compulsory school age are kept in school, if necessary, by force and by punishment of negligent parents. So if any of you were paying attention to Kamala Harris for the last couple of years and you heard her remarks about how she was going to punish parents in San Francisco, Kamala had 200 years of historical antecedent to refer back to. Okay, Prussian schools and German universities. So what happened with Prussia? Prussia was the military force for a long time, and in comes this guy, Napoleon. Hegel said that he saw Napoleon after the defeat of the Prussians at the Battle of Jena, Jena, in 1806. And this was a watershed moment in compulsory schooling. After this, Johann Fichte, the gentleman in the middle, who was a philosopher and a statesman, he made what he called the Address to the German Nation about how we really need to get ourselves in gear. We just lost to Napoleon. And if you don't know the history, I don't know how to convey to you just how monumental this will. So imagine there being 1,000 years of continuity of the Holy Roman Empire. Imagine you're the Germanic people who took down the original Roman Empire. And this guy Napoleon comes in, and he'd been battling for a while. It's known as the Battle of Jena and Auerstadt, two towns that are very close to each other. So Napoleon took one town, and a commander took another town. And Napoleon took his town. And a messenger came from the other town and said, "Napoleon, we took the town." No one was expecting this to happen. Napoleon was not expecting this to happen. And the commander of that platoon, or whatever you call it, battalion, he had some eye trouble, so he didn't see 100% clearly. So Napoleon's alleged response when the messenger said, "We took the city," he didn't believe it, and he said, "So-and-so has to get his vision checked." No one expected Napoleon to take this battle. He did. It was a wake-up call to the Prussians, these Germanic people. And I'm including the images of Fichte and Hegel here. A lot of us might be familiar with the term thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Often attributed to Hegel, it was actually articulated by Johann Fichte. So chronologically, we've got Immanuel Kant, Johann Fichte, Georg Friedrich, the peaceful Hegel. Hegel, his phrase was, in the course of historical development, truth emerges from error. Not to say that he didn't agree with Fichte, and I think it's fair to say, and the reason I'm including both of these here, it's fair to say that the people who came after them really bought into this philosophy. And that's rather important because when you're doing anything, really, but especially politics, schooling, the philosophy that's driving you as a thinker really impacts how you're doing this thing, whatever this thing is. And these were two grand, big thinkers, Fichte and Hegel. And Hegel is the originator, I guess, the articulator of the notion of freedom being realized within a modern state via laws. This is not a quote, this is just me summarizing. A modern state represents the political and legal embodiment of the people's collective spirit. And you'll hear this as I proceed and as we get to the Americans and the Chicagoans about the collective spirit. Citizens obey state laws so that we all can benefit from collective freedom. And this sounds a little bit more like liberty, right? This is not that ancient Germanic notion of Freiheit. This is really liberty. And, I'm not, as I said before, I don't know any of this. This is all interesting to think about. Are we really, truly free with, thought experiment? Binaristically, you've got one or the other option. In which are you potentially more self-actualized and free? Is it within a state where you have cell phones and running water and electricity and smartphones? Or can you realize your self-actualized freedom more in the saguaros, in the Sonoran Desert, all by yourself with no electricity and just, maybe not even the shirt on your back, right? Something to contemplate. So let's come back stateside. And now we are stateside. So it's 1852 in Massachusetts, and this is the first mandatory attendance law in the United States. An act concerning the attendance of school children. Children between ages 8 and 14 were required to attend at least 12 weeks out of the year, and at least 6 of those weeks had to be consecutive. And if not, then the guardian, parent or guardian, would be fined $20, which I'm guessing was a good chunk of change back in 1852. Mandatory attendance. Abraham Lincoln had already not gone to school at that point, right? He was born in 1809 or 1801, 1809, I think. So my note to myself is, so Abraham Lincoln had less than 12 months of schooling. And the schooling Abraham Lincoln received was by what are known as itinerant teachers. So itinerant means some guy that's just wandering from place to place. Or maybe they're static, but you have this teacher now for a little while, another teacher for a little while. And it was a total of less than 12 months. This is Abraham Lincoln before this law, right? So what if Abraham Lincoln had gone to school, right? We all know how revered he is as a thinker and a statesman. But how much better could Abraham Lincoln have been if he had gone to pre-K and kindergarten, first grade through 8th grade, graduated from TUSD high school, maybe gone to college, maybe got a graduate degree and MBA maybe. Just think how magnificent he could have been, or how much worse. So now we're getting into the thick of it. There's a few people that are coming up, and I tried to condense it in just the bare minimum number of people. You don't have to remember all these names. In fact, I'll alert you to the name you really should remember. Horace Mann was known, still is known as the father of American education. He was the first Secretary of Education in Massachusetts. He was specifically inspired by the Prussians. He had 6 main principles that he wanted education to reflect. Public should not remain ignorant. All right, so we want to not have an ignorant public. Education should be paid for and controlled by the public. This education is best provided in schools with kids of a variety of backgrounds. Education must be non-sectarian, and this was a big deal back then because a lot of schools were sectarian, and they didn't mind laws saying that you had to send your kids to school, but they wanted a sectarian school. He was adamantly against that. And he wanted teachers to be professional and well-trained. He visited Prussia in 1843 on his honeymoon, actually. He married one of the Peabody sisters, and this sister, Mary, was one of the people that set up the first kindergarten in the United States. And she also authored several books. One was a Christian cookbook, which I found ironic because he was very adamant about non-sectarian schools, but his wife wrote a cookbook about Christian cooking. A couple things about Mann. So he was inspired by the Prussians, and really what he liked was they placed their students in grades by ages, which wasn't happening over here. So put them all in one grade by the same age, and then they travel together and they get promoted year by year by year. And another thing that he was very a proponent of was what we might call whole word reading or whole word learning, reading instruction. If you don't know, there has been, there still is, and there has been for a long time, a reading war that's going on. And it's very basically whole word or sight learning or look and say, like the old Dick and Jane readers. I don't know if any of you are old enough to have gone to school in the 60s in America. Versus what we would call phonics. There's different kinds of phonics, but very basically phonics looks at the little pieces of the word, like the word, for example. The TH makes the sound. It doesn't make a t sound, makes it the sound. And then in Word, you have W-O-R-D, word, and you put those sounds together versus the look, say, or sight word method, which he was a proponent of, even back then in the 1850s, where you show kids words and you have them memorize the word. So you would show them a book that says the word, and you would just say the word, and you would repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. And after a while, kids would memorize a whole bunch of words, and then they could start reading on their own, and then they would know some of these words, and the other words they could pick up by inference. I'm not a fan of that kind of teaching, although I've never been a reading instructor, but there is and has been a reading war that's been going on. He's one of them. Okay, Wilhelm Wundt. We're going back to Germany now. So at that time in the late 1800s, we had universities here in America. Harvard, 1636, Yale, Princeton. We had old universities. We did not have the PhD system that we have now. The Germans invented this. The doctor of philosophy. They invented this, and in the late 1800s, Americans were going over to Germany to study with these people like Wilhelm Wundt, who was one of the first professors of psychology, which is a brand new field back then. And these people that went over to Germany or Prussia came back and then implemented that system here in the United States. The reason I'm bringing that up in relation to Gatto and the whole dumbing us down thesis is that we had people in positions of expertise. So these were the experts, as you know today, right? If you have a PhD after your name, you're an expert, although some of us might think the exact opposite. But this was really the beginning of the experts dictating how this is going to proceed going forward. And it's really important in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when you have just literally a handful of universities in this country that are giving PhDs to people in psychology and education that then go around the country, all the way to California and everywhere in between. And that is how we can point back to just a handful of people and their theories and philosophies, like Wilhelm Wundt, who shared the philosophy of George Friedrich Hegel, that we are a collective animal and we achieve our freedom by this allegiance, if you will, to the state. As Wundt theorized and then allegedly demonstrated in his experimental psychology lab, he was the first person to do any kind of experimental psychology on humans, which meant he would have humans come into a lab and he would have them do stuff and poke them and prod them. And he came up with the notion or the belief or the philosophy that humans are a summation of their reactions to stimuli. So the soul, previously, psychology was a study of the soul, and there was this notion that everyone just kind of took for granted that there's a spirit and there's some kind of free will and there's something ineffable that we can't quite put our finger on. And Wundt said, no, we are really just automatons who react to stimuli. So you poke somebody, they do something. So we're born unstimulated, we come out of the womb, we start getting stimulated, and then that's our psychology, according to him and the people that studied under him. Why is he so important to us and schooling in America? It's because people from here went over to study over there with him specifically, the people that became psychologists and thought leaders in this country. And I'm just going to give you two of them. These are the two big ones. G. Stanley Hall. He was Wundt's first American student, and he was John Dewey's mentor. So if there's one name to remember when it comes to education in America, I'm going to suggest it's John Dewey. And it's not only because I'm from Chicago and he cut his teeth at the University of Chicago. But John Dewey was mentored by G. Stanley Hall. G. Stanley Hall is considered the father of child psychology. He wrote a book in 1904 called Adolescence, and that really put adolescence into consciousness, if you will. It became a word. Well, I guess it had been a word, but it became a word in terms of psychology of children in 1904. Not surprisingly, he was what we would call a eugenicist. He was recognized as a leader of the eugenics movement. G. Stanley Hall, if you haven't figured out, well, anybody know who any of these people are? Probably not. I didn't. Until I found out and I said, oh yeah, those two guys for sure. So G. Stanley Hall sitting in the middle. And if you didn't know how important he is, to his right is Sigmund Freud, and to his left is Carl Jung. And the three guys behind him, they certainly look cerebral to me. I don't know who they are, but They all look like a bunch of big thinkers. G. Stanley Hall gets 2 slides in this presentation. Before he became the first president of Clark University, so you see this photograph from the Clark University Archives. That's a university in Massachusetts. And that's a photograph of some, I don't know what exactly, but of some kind of work in their human psychology lab. So that this is what human experimental psychology looked like. And being a student of Wundt's, his first student, in my terminology, this was the antecedents of binary bits, right? So humans are not spiritualized condensed matter that have some kind of ineffable, undescribable, non-materialistic essence that really drives them and propels them through time and space. Rather, we're just matter and we can be poked and prodded. And human consciousness, in my words, human consciousness is like physical matter. It can be divisible into atoms. As I've tried to do in the last few months of reading, I've tried to read these people and as many original documents with as open a mind as possible, as if I really wanted this all to be true, as if I was on their team, so to speak. Versus in 2009 when I first read John Taylor Gatto. He was just preaching to the choir and I just flipped through that book. Now reading John Gatto, I'm trying to have a more skeptical approach, and there are some things that I can nitpick that I have disagreements with. So in defense of these guys back then in the late 1800s and in defense of the eugenicists, this was a time when science and technology really was coming up from kind of out of nowhere. And these were just a few decades after Charles Darwin and Francis Dalton and Herbert Spencer and their theories of human evolution. The beginning of physics, right? Like what we nowadays call chemistry and hard physics, and getting down to the atom, right? So this undivisible thing, which is a Greek word actually, and atom means not divisible, right? Which is ironic because now we have something that we call an atom, and it's actually divisible. So to give these guys the benefit of the doubt, maybe these bits that they were looking for are actually like further subdivisible and subdivisible and subdivisible. The other of the 2 students of Wundt's, I'm just giving you 2, these are the 2 big ones. And again, G. Stanley Hall went to Johns Hopkins University, which is going to come up in a moment. There's only a few universities to remember: Johns Hopkins, Columbia University, and University of Chicago. If you had to remember 3, those are it. And Johns Hopkins was a brand new university at that time. So was University of Chicago, for that matter. James McKean Cattell. He was Wundt's student and Wundt's first assistant. Just in case you didn't think this guy was important, he was in the Department of Psychology at Columbia University for 25 years. He supervised 344 PhDs. I've never done PhD work, but you can imagine in 25 years doing 344 students to do a dissertation or whatever work they were doing. That's more than a dozen per year, every year for 25 years. That's a lot. That's very impressive. And I don't say that only to compliment him on how much work he did, but to convey just how important this guy was and what he thought and what he believed, and how powerful just a few people can be if they're in positions of authority and then can steer the thought around the country to a point where people don't even know that there's a different way of conceptualizing these things. I'm going to reference back to the whole word debate on reading. So this guy was a whole word advocate, if you will, and he developed what he called total word pictures. So one of the experiments he did at Leipzig, so Leipzig is in Germany today, Prussia back then, working with Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, East Germany today. Cattell experimented on adults. So he got some kind of, 1880s technology to look at humans' eyeballs as they were reading text. So in the 1890s, he alleges that humans, when they read, do not look at each individual part of each word. Rather, these people read whole words. And so this was scientific evidence, and maybe they called it proof or conclusive evidence that whole word reading is really the way to teach kids. Why waste your time with phonics? It just takes, and it's just a waste, and it's the wrong direction. Kids would be better off reading whole words. I don't think he ever considered the fact that he was working on adults And as any of you, I'm assuming we've all learned to read at some point in our life. So at the very beginning, you're like kind of doing this and you're going through letter by letter, word by word. But once you reach a certain age, you're just kind of skimming. And a lot of us are probably not even looking at every word. So this was a clear and easy criticism of his claim. These people already knew how to read. So even if they're reading whole words, this probably isn't the best way to teach kids how to read in the first place. As I said, I'm trying to maintain an open mind. And sometimes, I look at, especially the next slide that's coming up, you look at people and you say, oh, these are the bad guys. And I'm going to sneak preview something that John Taylor Gatto says. It's not about finding the bad guys. Like, even if you found bad guys, really, that's not what our thing is all about in trying to figure out schooling or make schooling better. But that being said, sometimes the bad guys just like, man, people, they just seem bad. My heart was softened by James McKean, by the anecdote that in 1917, right? So you see that he was there for 25 years, revered, right? Internationally renowned. He was fired from Columbia College. The reason was that he was protesting the conscription of young men to go to World War I, this war on the other side of the world, kind of. He was fired. And that led to tenure. So anyone who's had tenure at a university, you can go thank James McKean Cattell, because he was fired. And after that, they developed tenure so people could, at university, professors could speak their mind. Okay, the bad guys. One of the works that John Taylor Gatto referenced in his research was the work of Anthony Sutton. If you don't know him, I'll just try to make it brief. Anthony Sutton was a professor. He was an economics scholar. He was a fellow at the Hoover Institute. He taught at UCLA for a number of years, economics in the 60s. And he was mainstream intellectual. And he wrote some important pieces in his life. According to Charlotte Iserby, this is what Anthony Sutton said. On the bottom left, the most important piece I ever wrote was this piece that appears within a larger book that he wrote on the secret order of Skull and Bones at Yale University. And nowadays that's kind of out in, it's kind of like in open knowledge. I don't know if it's common knowledge, but it's not denied anymore. So previously, this had been just flat out denied that there existed this society, unless you're on Yale's campus. So allegedly, there were groups as early and late as the 1870s that were vehemently against the secret club Skull and Bones students, and they were writing about it. And they were told in no uncertain terms that you're not going to write about that anymore. So the three gentlemen here that we have pictures of are three members of Skull and Bones. What is Skull and Bones? It's a secret society at Yale University. These are 15 seniors in college, and they are hand-selected by current members. So current members hand-select the future members, and they go through some secret ordinations, which are not so secret anymore. Some very important people have been members of the society. Recently, if you remember the 2004 US presidential election, that was the only time that we've had two Skull and Bones members that were duking it out. We had John Kerry and George W. Bush. George W. Bush was the son of a member. George H.W. Bush was a member of Skull and Bones. Anthony Sutton wrote his books in the 1980s. He also wrote books on how Wall Street funded the Nazis, how Wall Street funded the Communist Revolution in Russia. And if you've never been confronted with any kind of allegation, you might, and justifiably, you might think, well, that's crazy. Sutton, to his credit, he finds original documentation that is irrefutable to the point that no one refutes him. They simply stop inviting him to give lectures. They simply cut off funding at his office at the Hoover Institute on Stanford's campus. They stop talking to him, and he gets no one to publish his books anymore. Anyway, Sutton said this was the most important piece I ever wrote, and it was on how these guys control education. And the last thing I'll say about Bush. So in the 1980s, I think it was when George H.W. was still vice president, somebody that Sutton knows wrote a letter. This is before World Wide Web and email. Someone wrote a letter to his office and asked, is it true that George H.W. Bush was a member of this secret society? And Sutton relates this anecdote that surprisingly they got a response. Like, we just thought they wouldn't respond, but they did. And the response was, George H.W. Bush is not a member of any sordid secret society. And obviously that was not the question. The question was he a member of this society, not a sordid society? But now we know that he was. And we know that because Anthony Sutton received a box of books that was just bequeathed to him by Charlotte Iserby, who I'll mention later, but she was a woman who wrote a book called The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, from which I took a lot of information here. Charlotte Iserby got these documents from her father on his deathbed. Her father had been a member of Skull and Bones, and his father had also been a member of Skull and Bones. So up until this point, around 1980, we just didn't know who was even in this group. She delivers to Anthony Sutton, here's the names. And we have names going back a long time. And he, being an original source kind of researcher, goes and pores through everything he can. And he reads these people's unread autobiographies just to look for little nuggets of what happened where. And he finds little nuggets like about G. Stanley Hall, who I just mentioned, who was not in the Order of Skull and Bones. He had no connection to Rockefeller or Carnegie. He preceded them. And I'll talk about Rockefeller and Carnegie in a moment. But G. Stanley Hall talks about in his autobiography, like, wow, I don't know why this happened, but I suddenly got promoted to this job and I was placed here at Johns Hopkins University. And so Sutton hypothesizes, well, that's because the president of Johns Hopkins, Daniel Coit Gilman, the first president, just hand-selected you. So G. Stanley Hall and James McKean Cattell, who I just mentioned, these were not members of a secret society, but they were put into positions by these people right here. So these are just three of the most important that Sutton talks about at great length. Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale, Andrew White, first president of Cornell, and first president of the American Historical Association. Why is that important? Because we have a mythology or a sense of who we are as a collective people based on the history that we read. And it's very critical, if you're this kind of a person, right, who wants to steer the world, it's very critical to get your people into important positions to write the historical record. For example, the 9/11 Commission in Congress, right? Do you remember who was it? I know someone remembers who was originally supposed to lead that investigation, but then was caught up. Who was originally supposed to lead the investigation? Kissinger. Henry Kissinger. And a bunch of moms and wives came out and said, F you, no way, you get somebody else. And who did they get? Philip Zelikow from Stanford, I believe, colleague of Condoleezza Rice. And what was Philip Zelikow's specialty? Philip Zelikow's specialty was, I think it was called contemporary history. And what is that? So his specialty was the writing of history in live time. And one of the criticisms of Philip Zelikow was he had transcribed a bunch of the Nixon tapes. And another researcher went and listened to the Nixon tapes and read along. And he said, hey, there's a few mistakes. They're pretty small, but they're magnificently critical, right? Like, the importance of like cutting out a word here or there. Like, he is great versus he is not great, right? I mean, that's a facetious example. And he wrote and wrote and wrote, and there was just never any response. So you get people in positions of power. So the American Historical Association is very important. And Daniel Coit Gilman, first president of Johns Hopkins. And the Gilman School, you might have heard the Gilman School in the news recently. There was a 26-year-old guy that shot and killed CEO of United Healthcare. That guy went to this affluent school in Maryland. It's called Gilman School, named after this guy. It was the first country day school in the country. What are country day schools where elite people sent their kids to get a little bit out of the city and into the country. More bad guys, Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. The more I read about Andrew Carnegie, I don't think he was a bad guy. However, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching certainly steers and moves not only the conversation, but actually how stuff works in education. So they were responsible for what we know as college credit units. They created the College Board, which does the SAT and education testing services. Some of you might know the name Abraham Flexner, the Flexner Report from Rockefeller Medicine kind of stuff. Well, he actually, before that, he wrote a report called The American College. He worked for the Carnegie Foundation, and he also eventually worked for the Rockefeller Foundation. Maligned the state of American colleges back then. So they, basically speaking, they need to be standardized. We need to come up with a national curriculum, and we need to flatten this. My terms, we need to flatten this all out. I try to keep an open mind with the bad guys. Abraham Flexner, before he got involved in all this, graduated, I think, with a degree in classics, but he had a BA, and then he opened up a high school. And I don't know much about it, but it was some kind of alternative high school where they did things a little bit more holistically and organically, and allegedly prepared people for universities better than the government schools. Anyway, that's Flexner working for the Carnegie Foundation. I won't go into them too much. I have a quote that I'll just touch on very briefly. If you listen to the Libertarian Minded podcast of Millie and Peter and Tara put that one together, they reference this and they read the whole text. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but this is from the first publication from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. In our dream, we have limitless. Okay, they're dreaming, right? So, okay, this is like, let's just dream big. What would that look like? Dreaming big. What's this going to look like? What's this education going to look like? We have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand. The present education conventions fade from their minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. So, okay, give them the benefit of the doubt. This is really geared toward rural people. Turn of the century. The Civil War ended in 1865. This is 1900 something. Trying to give them the benefit of that. They're just trying to help poor people, right? Which is what's happening with all these foundations, and certainly the main driving force for public schools, really. Whether they say it or not, we got to help these poor kids. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers or men of learning or men of science. We don't have to raise them up. We don't have to raise up from among them authors, editors, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, even humbler than painters and musicians, the lawyers, doctors, and preachers, politicians, and statesmen, of whom we have ample supply. We got enough of these guys. So we need to teach you how to till the land, how to work, and how to just stay in your place. That's the essence of this. People were critical of this when it was happening. So the NEA, which I could say a lot of critical things about, but they had a resolution from the normal school section at their meeting in 1914 in Minnesota. We view with alarm the activity of the Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations, agencies not in any way responsible to the people, in their efforts to control the policies of our state educational institutions, and it goes on and on. So these people were being challenged from the get-go. But let's remember, the money and the power of these two, I think we all know this, right? Imagine Elon Musk, Bill Gates, whoever, this is more. Now we're going to get to the one name in education, if you had to remember a name in education, not only because I'm from Chicago and he really cut his teeth in Chicago, John Dewey, philosopher, psychologist, the major educational reformer of the 20th century. He wrote a lot of really important works, one of which I read in grad school when I got my master's in education, Democracy and Education. My Pedagogic Creed, which I'm going to read from. You could read from anything that he wrote. It's he's very impassioned, but it's very clearly what we might call a socialist democratic or democratic socialist collectivist mentality. To give him the benefit of the doubt, what was going on in the world at that time, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany in the 1930s. Adolf Hitler had an 8-foot portrait of Henry Ford in his office. Wall Street, read Anthony Sutton. Wall Street was funding Hitler. Hitler was referencing the sterilization and eugenics laws in the United States and saying, hey, these guys are doing it. We got to get our act together over here in Germany. That was the time frame that this was happening. Again, I'm trying to give him the benefit of the doubt. He really just wanted to help people, John Dewey. I've listed just 3 key institutions that he was involved with. So he was mentored by G. Stanley Hall at Johns Hopkins, as we just mentioned, who G. Stanley Hall was put into place, a couple of places, by members of the order. The University of Chicago was not brand new, but it really just took off after the Rockefeller money came in, not only with its medical school, but also a school of education. And they created a school called the Laboratory School. And if you're from Chicago, you call it the Lab School. I have a friend who sends his kids there. It's still a great place to send your kids. It's very expensive. It's more holistic. They tend to the whole child. There's a lot of good you could say about it. Anyway, so Rockefeller money at University of Chicago, and then Carnegie money at Columbia University. So after being at University of Chicago for a number of years, John Dewey goes to Columbia University Teachers College, and those are the 3 universities. Remember, Johns Hopkins, University of Chicago, and Columbia. Here's what Anthony Sutton said about John Dewey. The history of the implementation of Dewey's objectives is also the history of the larger foundations, i.e., Ford, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Peabody, Sloan, Slater, and 20th century. Speaking of going to primary sources, I spent a lot of time tracking down quotations, and I've got a bunch of quotations. I'd love to share with you the original source. So if you insist after we're all done here, I might share those with you. But there's a reference in a book to a speech by John Dewey called The Primary Education Fetish from 1898, in which this author, Huey, his name is Huey, talking about Dewey. So Huey says, Dewey calls reading, the fetish of the primary grades. In other words, parents are too worried about reading. We got to get these kids self-actualized. And this is what Dewey's whole philosophy of education was, just get a little like Montessori maybe, or maybe even Waldorf school kind of, maybe for good and maybe in the good and the bad sense of the word at the same time. I'm just going to read a couple quotes from his pedagogic creed. So he wrote a book called My Pedagogic Creed, and creed means your belief system. And I really got to commend him for calling it a creed, because it is what he believes. And it made me think of the Communist Manifesto. I'm sure most of us have heard of the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Do you know what the name of the Communist Manifesto originally was? Communist Confession of Faith. Whoa. Communist Confession of Faith. Wow. And Engels said, let's call it a manifesto. It's got a better ring to it. To Dewey's credit, he called it a creed. Okay. I believe that education is the fundamental method of social progress and reform. I believe it is the business of everyone interested in education to insist upon the school as the primary and most effective interest of social progress and reform of society. Now, these were progressive educators, right? Like today, probably in circles we run around in, progressive is considered a pejorative, right? So it's not exactly high complimentation to somebody. Back then, I mean, it was overwhelmingly progressive education. And the reason I say that is because this spoke a lot about what was happening around the country. Again, to go back to Hegel, go back to Wundt, go back to these psychologists. Dewey was a psychologist. And these are the people who are in charge of educating the young. And if not specifically educating them like he was a teacher for a while. These are people who are in positions of presidents of universities, chairs of education departments. They're running normal schools, as they're called, to teach teachers how to teach. And back then, there weren't a lot of places where you learned how to become a teacher. So this is where it all goes back to. Okay, just one more. I believe that in this way, he has a lot more of what I just said. So in other words, collectivism, teaching the kid that he's part of this organic, collectivist, social whole, rather than an individual autonomous being with some kind of ineffable spirit and free will, and he's just going to do his own thing in life. I believe that in this way, the teacher always is the prophet of the true God, capital G, and the teacher is the usherer in of the true kingdom of God. Don't have to remember this guy's name, but Alexander Inglis, if you look him up, he was at Harvard for a long time. They named an annual lecture after him. John Taylor Gatto read about this book, Principles of Secondary Education, and he couldn't find it. Just like when John Taylor Gatto heard about Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. And he was traveling around the world, around the country at that time giving lectures, and he couldn't get his hands on a copy of Tragedy and Hope by Carol Quigley. Carol Quigley was a mentor to Bill Clinton. He was a history professor at Georgetown for 20 years. He wrote this book that sold out called Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time, 1,300 pages. And Bill Clinton, at his acceptance speech in 1992, at the very end, you can look it up on YouTube, at the very end, he says, "I heard the call from two people, John F. Kennedy and Carol Quigley." And John Taylor Gatto thought, who's this Carol Quigley? And he had already retired from school at that point, from being a school teacher, and he couldn't find a copy of the book. Every library he looked at, it was either lost or not returned. And he thought, that's interesting. And according to Gatto, at some point, if you know this name, Stan Monteith wrote him a letter and said, "Hey, John, I've got that book. I'll send you a copy. Send me $35, okay?" So that Stan Monteith gave the book to John Taylor Gatto. Anyway, so similarly, this book, Principles of Secondary Education, written by a professor at Harvard, referenced by another Harvard author, and John Taylor Gatto couldn't find it, and he went to Harvard, and he said, "Hey, I'm looking for this book that was referenced by James Conant. It's called Principles of Secondary Education." And according to John Taylor Gatto, they kind of said, "Oh, why do you want that book?" Said, "Oh, well, James Conant. Okay, well, we'll get back to you." A long time goes by, and he had to twist some arms, and he finally got the book. Anyway, so Alexander Inglis had, as John Taylor Gatto describes, and this falls under the rubric of dumbing us down, right? So the dumbing down really includes a lot of standardization and homogenization, and as H.L. Mencken said at the beginning of this presentation, to put down dissent, right? So you are dumbing people in perhaps the literal sense of the word, right? Like, you know what dumb means, right? Like you can't talk. A person who is dumb doesn't have the ability to speak. So the 6 functions by Alexander Inglis, and this was education practical scholarship. So around the country, this is what was happening in secondary schools and probably also primary schools, these 6 functions. The hygienic refers to racial hygienic, and the propaidutic, I had to look this word up myself. I mean, you can see paidos in there, right? Kid or children. That's where we get the word pedagogy, and pediatrician, it's the Greek word for child. It's where we get the word pedagogue. So pedagogy comes from, so pedagogy is the science of teaching. Like, how do we teach? That's pedagogy or pedagogy. A pedagogue, back in ancient Greece, and actually the Romans had this word, was a slave. So John Taylor Gatto has a great line, "Free men were never pedagogues." So a pedagogue was the slave that just makes sure the kid was doing his work, which I love, because pedagogue, I mean, if you look at the history of pedagogy, it's some slave who doesn't know what's going on, just whipping some kid to do this thing that someone else told us to do. So the propaidutic function is something that's taught to a very small number of people, and these are the people that are going to be leaders and run the rest of us, you know, that shop at Walmart. Just a couple of quick things to put this into historical perspective. Council on Foreign Relations is founded around that same time, which John Dewey was a big fan of. 1922, they officially endorsed world government. I'm not going to go through all these names, but there you see who initiated George H.W. Bush into Skull and Bones. That was Henry Simpson. And I'm including William Paley in this list. And I get this from Charlotte Iserby, who wrote the book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of Education of America. And her book is about 1,000 pages of just original source documents. And this was one of them. I'm not going to read the source, but I'm going to read a quote here. But Edward Bernays, as some of you know, is the author of Propaganda. He had been the advisor to William Paley, who I didn't know was the founder of CBS. Edward Bernays was the paternal nephew of Sigmund Freud. He wrote a book called Propaganda in 1928, which really means he was working all this out for years, if not longer. So by this time, by 1921, 1922, Bernays is already, I think, he's already implementing what he's about to talk about. So propaganda, which nowadays propaganda is kind of like a negative connotation. Back then it was just, which I appreciate, it was just like propagating a plant, like cultivating, propagating, like you're making it grow. Right? We're going to propagandize our information or our way of thinking. I'm going to read you this quote. And my note to myself is, what if this quote were required reading for every public school elementary student or high school student? So what if each student had to read this every year or even every quarter or even every day? It's not a long quote. When I went to Catholic grade school, we said the Our Father and the Hail Mary every day, the Pledge of Allegiance every day. What if we heard this or read this every day? Edward Bernays telling it like it is back in the 1920s. Quote, "Those who manipulate the organized habits and opinions of the masses constitute an invisible government, which is the true ruling power of the country. It remains a fact in almost every act of our daily lives, whether in the sphere of politics or business, in our social conduct or our ethical thinking. We are dominated by this relatively small number of persons. As civilization has become more complex, and as the need for invisible government has been increasingly demonstrated," like they're not hypothesizing this, it's just it's clear, it's demonstrated. We need this invisible government. Like no desire on their part. Like this just is how it is. "The technical means have been invented and developed by which opinion may be regimented." If you don't think this is happening in school, like it's not just relegated to selling candy bars and coffee. You know, it's in the school where this is happening. Final thing I'll say, like if you don't think this is going on, so George Counts, you don't have to remember this name, but he got his PhD where? University of Chicago. Where did he work for 30 years? Columbia Teachers College. This is from a longer quote, but really this is, so even in context, this is what he's saying. "Our democratic tradition must of necessity evolve and gradually assume an essentially collectivistic pattern." That was 1932. Again, like Socrates, I don't claim to know anything. I'm trying to think about this as I go on, and I imagine I'll be thinking about this for the rest of my life. You know, if you're doing schooling or even education of any kind, it's just inherently philosophical. Like news, right? Quote unquote news. Like, is the news biased or not biased? No, it's not biased. Well, it's inherently biased by even what we're talking about. What are we even bringing to the table to think about in our consciousness, let alone what we're teaching kids, let alone something we do every day, like the Pledge of Allegiance, something I did every day. Although when I was a kid, I put my hand on my heart. I went to school in the 70s and 80s. But earlier, this photo is not from 1885. The Pledge of Allegiance was begun in 1885, and I rather admire the very original version of the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to my flag and the republic for which it stands, one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And this photograph obviously is from 30s, and when you see the next photo, you're going to realize, oh yeah, this is the 1930s. And this is what it often looked like in the 1930s. I would like, who said that? Was it? Yeah. Is that how you did it, Tom? Oh my God, yeah. Wow. I'm scared to even replicate this. Like, there it is. I'm not even going to do it.
You're being filmed.
No way.
What year is that?
30s. I don't know this photograph exactly, but the 30 and the 40s. Really? And the 40s.
So after World War I, before World War II.
Well, Tom, can I say when you were born? Can I say when you were born? Just to give this context, yeah. Tom was born in 1936. So if you were doing this in the 40s, the war was already going on, if not over. Yeah. So we knew like the primary association of this, what we called the Bellamy salute. So a question for libertarians to ponder, you know, or people in general, what's so bad about patriotism? And how would kids learn to be patriotic if we didn't teach it, right? So again, bring it back to schooling, we're indoctrinating them with something. The nature of doing schooling, you're giving them some kind of belief in something, not only a framework, some kind of belief. Okay, I'm not going to talk about this more than 1 minute. Try to give myself 1 minute. Some cases that came up. Buck versus Bell. Carrie Buck was a woman, a 17-year-old girl in Virginia. And why is this important? Because 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled on this, and this was the first sterilization laws in the United States, which were the first sterilization laws in the world. Where was the first sterilization law? 1907, Indiana. What was going on in Indiana prior to 1907? Well, at Indiana University, the president, who had been a professor before becoming president, was David Starr Jordan. Starr with 2 R's. David Starr Jordan. Why is he important? First president of Stanford University. Not a nobody, right? Like, these are very important people. And David Starr Jordan was famous in small circles for a class that he conducted, which was by invitation only, which he called bionomics, right? And if you know the etymology, nomos means the law of bios, right? The law of life. And guess what that was? Well, he was an ichthyologist, right? So if you know what ichthyology is, you can figure out what bionomics means, right? So that's with fish. So he was a zoologist, basically. So he was a fish expert, and he was also a eugenicist, right? As all these guys were, basically. Which is not to say that everybody was, right? So there's no time in this presentation to list all the people that were decrying this, like the H.L. Menckens, right? There were many, Upton Sinclair, another one, like muckraker journalists, like decrying all this stuff. But good luck fighting against these people who have on their back, supporting them, not only the Order of Skull and Bones, Carnegie, and Rockefeller, but by the time by the time the Council on Foreign Relations is founded in the 1920s, you've got 40 years of this going on at these small institutions, and then more institutions open up that are then the people that are 1 or 2 generations away. So it's the same it's the same framework, as somebody said. 1907 was the first sterilization law in the world, and it was in Indiana. And it was not formally rescinded until 1974, by which time they had around 2,500 sterilization, which means people that are in state custody, assumedly against their will, right? 2,500. And I thought, well, that's a lot, until I found out the number that California was doing in just a couple decades, the thousands. And guess who they were probably informed by? David Starr Jordan, who was the president of Stanford University from the, I think, 1912, early 1900s. So Virginia was the 3rd or 4th state to try to do sterilization. So they were not the first, not second. So this girl, Carrie Buck, she's 17 years old. Her mother had been put into this institution in Virginia called the Colony for Epileptics and the Feeble-Minded, which I think that's an interesting combination, epileptics and feeble-minded. And the mother was in there, and her condition was immorality and prostitution, and she had syphilis. And she had given birth to 5 kids, and she was poor, and she couldn't support them. And one of her kids, Carrie Buck, by accounts from her school, allegedly was an average student. Her foster mother took her out of school at 6th grade to just focus on housework. When Carrie, so it's around age 12, right? She's taken out of school, having been an average student. And then at age 17, she was raped by the nephew of that adoptive mom. And the parents are, back then, put yourself in the 1920s in Virginia. They're embarrassed. We got to get rid of this girl. She goes to the same colony of epileptics and feeble-minded, where the same guy is working there. So the head recognizes her and says, "Oh, you're so-and-so's daughter, and you just gave birth," right? So, long story short, Virginia wants to sterilize her because she's an imbecile. So makes its way to the Supreme Court, so it was 1924. 1927 makes its way to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court says we are not going to rule on the worthiness of this law. We're just going to rule on the legislative procedure, just to make sure that the procedures were followed. It's up to the state to decide what laws you're going to make, right? Okay, as libertarians, that's great. Like, we should have more state rule, if you will, than federal rule. But they kind of couldn't help themselves. So it was an 8-1 ruling to uphold that, and they had been waiting to sterilize her until that point. So in 1927, there's an 8-1. That's an overwhelming victory. And then they sterilized her, and they sterilized her sister as well, without her sister knowing. Her sister went in for an appendectomy, and her sister didn't know this until the 1980s. After having tried over and over to get pregnant with her husband, it wasn't until the 1980s she figured this out. So again, they're not ruling on the worth of this law. It just was the process followed correctly, but they couldn't help themselves. And he sums it up. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough, which had just been in 1905, that's the next one, which I'm not going to talk about. So 1905, that was the Massachusetts ruling. Jacobson tried to say, hey, I had a terrible reaction to this vaccine previously. I don't want to get vaccinated. And Massachusetts said, well, that's fine, just pay the fine. He said, no, I don't want to pay the fine. Makes its way to the Supreme Court. He lost. And there was a 7-2 opinion. So overwhelming, right? And the wording on that opinion, on the Jacobson opinion, was, for a well-ordered society, liberty is going to be sacrificed to maintain, a reasonable amount of accommodation. Oliver Wendell Holmes, Buck versus Bell. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Who were the Shippey brothers? These were 3 Idaho brothers who had dozens of kids between them. They went to jail in the 1980s for homeschooling. It wasn't until the 80s that homeschooling became legal. In this state, Arizona, where we have very lenient laws with homeschooling, it wasn't until 1982 that it was fully legal. And rights versus responsibilities of parents. Nowadays, I hear language like parents don't have rights, they have responsibilities for their kids. I'm going to skip these questions and comments and try to fly through this. There's John Taylor Gatto. If you ever have time, sit down for this 5-hour interview on tragedyandhope.com. I suggest you go do that. That's him in his later years. As I said before, he says there's 2 wrong ways of looking at the problem of schooling. Who are the bad guys? Because it kind of doesn't even matter who the bad guys are. Thinking of it as just an engineering problem, right? Which is, these are the 2 ways that most people think about it. All we got to do is tweak a little bit here, fix that, get rid of this bad guy, screw this thing in a little bit differently, and that's just not how it works. In this book, Dumbing Us Down, I happen to have a first edition copy. The very first essay is The 7-Lesson School Teacher, and these are the 7 lessons that are implicitly taught to kids. So clearly this is not part of the curriculum. And I've colored orange and green to indicate what might be arguable and what is inarguable and unavoidable. So in green are just what's unavoidable. I think these are all true, but I mean, to give them the sake of argument, benefit of the doubt, you could argue we're not teaching confusion, class position, indifference, emotional dependence. So the emotional dependence is the dependence on the teacher for emotional feedback, like you're doing a good job. The indifference to being overwhelmed, like confusion, being overwhelmed with, as John Taylor Gatto said, I teach too much. And if you've ever looked at scope and sequence, as it's called, in a subject, let alone the school, I bet there's no school in the country that's ever teaching all that's on the scope and sequence. So the stuff they tell you that they're teaching, you just can't. There's just too much. So that's a confusion and that leads to indifference. Class position, so you kind of learn where you fit in the schema, and then you tend to stay in that position. What's inarguable, I think, are the intellectual dependence, which means you are being told what we're going to study. Very basically, that's just unavoidable. There's no school where you're going to sit. I mean, unless it's one of these, unschooling schools that might be oxymoronic, but you're depending on some expert, really. And as John Taylor Gatto said, it's not even me. It's some committee of faceless people, a few degrees separated from me, that's telling me what to do. And these kids are depending on this chain of command, this hierarchy of experts. Provisional self-esteem, and this is grades, basically. You're getting graded rather than constantly being self-evaluated. And the constant surveillance, those are my words. So everything else is his words. I called it constant surveillance. He calls it one can't hide. And what he called the surveillance was homework. Now he wrote these essays. This essay probably was in the late 80s, early 90s. For constant, again, I call it constant surveillance. He called it homework, but he uses the word surveillance. Gatto says, I assign a type of extended schooling called homework, so that the effect of surveillance, if not the surveillance itself, which we have full-blown, like spoiler alert, that's coming up very soon. We have full-blown surveillance. I'm looking at it right now. It's all over the place. Back then, when all we had in our homes was a rotary phone and a television set. The effect of surveillance, if not the surveillance itself, travels into private households. So you're being surveilled like tomorrow, basically. Did you do the homework, basically? These private households where students might otherwise use their free time to learn something unauthorized. Another essay in his book is The Psychopathic School. I originally had a section on social emotional learning. Some of you might already know about that. This is a photograph of some wonderful people who met in Salzburg, Austria, the Salzburg Global Seminar. Not to pick on them. I mean, this just looked like such a beautiful photo. I probably would want to be all these people's friends. But I think this photograph just really sums up this quote from this essay, The Psychopathic School. Thousands of humane, caring people work in schools as teachers, aides, administrators. But here's the killer phrase: the abstract logic of the institution overwhelms their individual contributions. So what might schooling look like that's not dumbing down, right? So what could it be, right, to give us a sense of how we're being dumbed down? He wrote an essay on the 14 principles of elite schools. So something he did as part of his original research is he visited these schools like Groton, Phillips Exeter, Andover. They're mostly on the East Coast. They're mostly boarding schools, places where George Bush and John Kerry went to school, for example. So what did they do? So there's 14 points. I did not include all of them. And again, I have a color scheme of, so in green, I think, are what TUSD or a public school might say, oh yeah, we're doing that, to give them the benefit of the doubt. Like whether that's actually accomplished is another story. But in orange, I think, are the things that just are not happening. And number one, as Gatto says, first and foremost, at elite schools, kids develop a theory of human nature. So they develop a theory of human nature. They do independent work, truly independent work. And the reason that the horse is here is that one of John Taylor Gatto's quotes was, everywhere in this system of elite education, you'll find arrangements that place the child alone in an unguided setting with a problem to solve, such as the problem of galloping a horse or making it jump. And I've worked with horses just a little bit. And if you haven't, I'll tell you, these are 1,000-pound creatures. Like you have to do a combination of mind control and like, especially a kid is not going to overpower a horse, maybe a puppy or a little cat, but a 1,000-pound horse, this takes some work. And as he says, it's a problem that successfully has been solved by thousands of elite children before the age of 10. Can you imagine anyone who had mastered such a challenge ever lacking the confidence in his ability to do anything ever again? And I'll insert another, just one of many anecdotes of John Taylor Gatto. This one is Richard Branson. You might know him of Virgin Airways fame, flamboyant billionaire. When he was so he wrote about this, I think, in his biography. I heard about it from John Taylor Gatto. When he was 4, his mother, he had a single mother who was an airline stewardess, and he's from London. And just imagine, he's 4. So when was this? Like the 60s, I'm guessing. They're in London, and she asks 4-year-old Richard Branson, "Do you think you can find your way home from here?" And he looks around. He's like, "Yeah, probably." She's like, "Okay, get out and walk home." And according to John, according to Richard, she drove off. So she didn't simply like hide behind and make sure he was going in the right direction. She drove off, and he made his way home. And this gets to the point of independent work and giving people a challenge. And then in orange, the things that just are not happening in public schools and most private schools, a theory of access to places and people. So how do you access a CEO? Like, how do you get access to people in positions of power? And another quick anecdote, we've all heard of John Lennon, right? So Yoko Ono, his widow, tried to install at Central Park what's known as Strawberry Fields, and it exists. So Strawberry Fields is a small section of Central Park. Originally, that was voted down. So whatever that committee was, they said, no, we're not doing this. And Gatto was an 8th grade teacher at the time, and a couple of his students said, oh, we got to do something about this. And Gatto was never a fan of the Beatles. As he said, they could only play 3 chords, and they weren't even very good at that. But if you want to do something about this, go get access to these people. So find out who's on the committee, find out where they live, find out something about these people, find the people that voted no, and find out something about them and go appeal to their heartstrings. And these girls did. And they successfully changed the vote. And Yoko Ono invited them personally to come to the opening of Strawberry Fields. Many killer quotes. And one that John Taylor Gatto quotes a homeschooling mother in Cape Cod who the authorities called her in to challenge her on how she was educating her kids. And her killer quote was, "The state does not have power to standardize children. My educational philosophy precludes the use of a curriculum. The priorities of our curriculum are daydreaming, etc., etc." Gatto was a big fan and proponent of homeschooling and what he called open source education, which maybe meant something different in the 90s and early 2000s from what it means today. And as he said, we need less school, not more, and we need to focus on communities. And he was very adamant that a network is not a community. So network is some place, some organization, and this might even be a network, Libertarian Party. It certainly is, where you give a piece of yourself. You do not give the whole totality of yourself like you would in a community, like where I grew up in the north side of Chicago. Like, I'm so grateful that my school, my Catholic school that I attended, was in walking distance to my piano teacher and my babysitter, and walking distance to the Baptist church I grew up in. That was a community where we would walk outside and play, and we'd see our 6th grade teacher who lived walking distance. She'd be walking her dog. A community is not a network. Stop pretending that a network is a community. And Gatto was also not a fan of globalism. He's quoting Wendell Berry here. Wendell Berry said, "I don't think global thinking is futile. I think it's impossible." Okay, John Taylor Gatto died. I wish a lot of people were still around, and he's one of these people, because now we're entering really uncharted territory, as I call it. And I'm not making something up de novo, but a big ed data, big education, and our blockchain future, online, 6G, and great phrases like data-driven instruction, next generation curricula, permanent records on the blockchain, getting money from the state, like in the ESA, as Tara pointed out, getting your $7,000 from the state of Arizona to do your own education. Logically speaking, looking back to the history of this country, history of Europe, there's a tendency towards this pyramid of power, right? So we are consolidating power more and more and more. Just as the communities were consolidated into colonies, colonies were consolidated into a country, countries now are being consolidated into eventually what has been called world government and championed for a very long time. People like Peter can speak to this very thoroughly, the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. They have 17 of them, and number 4 is education. And who doesn't want this? Who doesn't want to ensure or encourage, as a 1785 land ordinance said, inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all? Who wouldn't want to do that? But what does it look like is the question, right? So now I'm totally taking or stealing some slides from Alison McDowell. So as I said at the very beginning, her blog is wrenchinthegears.com. As I've joked with Drew, and this is in all seriousness, I'm not at all going to say that I'm saying what she says. In fact, if someone can tell me what she's saying, I'd love to hear it. Because she's really on the vanguard of doing original research. She's reading white papers. She's going to the bibliography and looking at those white papers. So this is a slide from one of her presentations. I'm biased. I'll just say it. I'm biased. I have a 2-year-old right now, a very active, healthy 2-year-old boy. We go outside as much as possible and see nature as much as possible. These look like 4 or 5-year-olds with the VR goggles on. Okay, that's one way to do it, I guess. Where else are we seeing VR technology? This is very up to date, December 5th of this year. And if you know local Tucson school politics, and if you were around for the Mexican-American studies wars that were going on about 10 or 15 years ago, so here's La Cholla High School. So La Cholla High School, this just happened a couple weeks ago. A nonprofit from Phoenix came down, and this young student is watching a presentation on Native American artists. And this is multifacetedly amusing, to say the least. But, bringing Native American artistry to Tucson students, one of our most challenged high schools. And where is this all going? Again, a slide from Alison McDowell, planetary computer for a sustainable future through the power of AI. The sustainable future, planetary computer. And what that involves is the internet of bodies, the internet of things, the internet of people, the internet of our consciousness. And that's all going to involve the technology that we are being conditioned to. So why am I including this in this presentation, being dumbed down? Because being dumbed down is really, you might subsume dumb under conditioning, right? So conditioning is the big thing that school does. It doesn't have to dumb you down. In fact, it could really elevate you, but you're being conditioned, just as the slides I showed from medieval Europe, right? These scholars in churches were being conditioned to be the religious scholars or to work for the court, right? So there's conditioning that's happening all the time. And we're conditioning our kids to just walk into this planetary computer, and you're going to do stuff like, this is just one example. This is not Allison's slide, but I heard about this from her. Lifelong learning and work portfolio on the blockchain. You've heard of the permanent record, right? Like, I'm old enough to know that, like, in 7th grade, my permanent record wasn't even going to follow me to high school, let alone to adulthood. The permanent record of the blockchain is going to follow you forever and ever and ever, but that's okay, because it's going to enable your own sovereignty and mobility and agency. And another slide from Allison, just stealing it, because it's a conversation we need to have, right? I think parents should be having this conversation with their child. We should be having this conversation with our friends, because these people are having the conversation. And this is the new steering committee, if you will, right? And these are people a lot of us haven't even heard of. Like, does anybody recognize Governor Pritzker from Illinois? Some of you might. I have a very good friend, very intelligent, who I just reconnected with this past summer. Very intelligent. Had no idea who Klaus Schwab is, and it just floored me. How do you know who got those guys? Anyway, beware billionaires promoting homeschooling, because this is happening. They're promoting homeschooling. And what version of homeschooling is that? Well, go to this website, log in, get the app, get the smartphone, get the QR code. We've got the curriculum. It's so easy. And, get your $7,000 from Arizona State, right? It's just like Obama phones. They're free, right? What's wrong with that? They're free, right? And if you don't know how it physically works with Arizona, there's a site called Class Wallet, and Class Wallet is how you log in. You have your account. And then, so there's this feedback, there's this data return from the vendor. So the vendor gives you the stuff, and you communicate with the vendor, you get the money from the state, and then the data of what you're doing. So it's more and more. So for Gatto, the problem was homework coming into your household. And now we're really in uncharted territory. It's so much more. It's going to be your everyday movement, with the wearables that kids, which I don't have time to go into, but like not only the mood rings of Bill Gates from like 15 years ago. So he funded, kids in classroom can wear mood rings, and then the teacher can see the color changes on the rings and see who's paying attention. It's so much more than that. And it's only getting more and more and more and more and more. Anyway, John Taylor quotes, "Sparkle and shine in the face of darkness. You either learn your way towards writing your own script in life, or you unwittingly become an actor in someone else's." And that's becoming more and more difficult to do. So what do? We keep the embers burning, keep the spark, keep the fire going, somehow that fire of humanity. I'm not the only one to say this, but tradition is this handing down from person to person over time. And it's in that way that we are transmitting our humanity. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but how much can we transmit our humanity via, the future VR, 3-dimensional haptic bodysuit, FaceTiming with loved ones who are in some other place. So we do the tradition of transmitting our humanity from person to person to person. And I would love to have a conversation for a few minutes if anyone's got questions. I'd love to hear from where we might take inspiration, or even what to do. As I said, I have a 2-year-old, and up until 2 years ago, this was something that didn't affect me. And so I was very happy to be a former teacher who just got out of the system, and there's no way you can fix it. And that's easy to do if you don't have skin in the game, right? So now I have skin in the game, and the future is that much more important to me. Like anyone who has children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, you just know this, the future is that much more palpable and more real. So anyway, I'm just wondering, and I know we have people in the audience who can speak to any of all this, but does anyone have any comments? Get on the mic.
Well, my son was born in 1977, and in early, 79 maybe, a friend told me about John Holt. And John Holt had tried for decades to work within schools to reform them, and he finally decided there's something about the structure of a school itself that children are learning in spite of school, is what he concluded. And so he was encouraging people to do homeschooling in the sense of following the child's interests and supporting them. And he, what you asked, what would a school look like for someone like that? What he was advocating for was resource centers. So there would be tools that not every family could afford, like it didn't make sense for every family to duplicate, having a really good microscope or whatever those are. And I just wanted to put that out there, the idea that our kids are learning despite school and that school itself, the structure is just not promoting learning, really.
He's the one that coined the term unschooling.
Yeah.
Because when he coined that term, if you're old enough to remember the ad campaign for 7-Up, the Uncola. So he said, 7-Up is a flavored carbonated beverage. Coke is colas are, so we're doing the beverage, we're doing the education, we're not doing school. So it's an unschool kind of education.
I can't remember for sure who said it, but maybe you can. Who said, I don't want a nation of thinkers, I want a nation of workers. Rockefeller. And the year after he said that was when they started the Board of Education or Department of Education or whatever it was. Yeah.
I just wonder what people think about this. Like, I know most of us, I'm sure, in here were against all the COVID restrictions. And generally, it was seen as a bad thing that kids were taken out of school and they couldn't go to school. And I know they were supposed to be doing something on the computer. It kind of sounded like most of them weren't really doing whatever they were supposed to be doing, and most people see that as a bad thing. And when the kids finally got back to school, the teachers are complaining that the kids can no longer learn and sit still. But there was a part of me, because I'm familiar with Ivan Illich and some of these other thinkers, that maybe there was something good about the kids having free time and being able to pursue their own interests, even though they were isolated. So I don't know what people think about that.
It's a mixed bag, The slide I had from Mark Andreessen, the billionaire who is promoting homeschooling. So on the good side, people saw, via Zoom what was going on in the classroom. On the other hand, a lot of parents historically and still don't feel confident to do homeschooling. So now we have apps and websites where the curriculum is there for you. And that's what Mark Andreessen is promoting. He's a billionaire and he's invested in, I think it's called Novel Education. Elon Musk has an online school, Ad Astra. A lot of these billionaires are highly invested in that. I would suggest, or remind you, that's a network, not a community, and something more local, more organic is probably the direction we need to go, given what I ended with, like the work of Alison McDowell, which we know, the panopticon state, it's only going to get more and more full-blown in a handful of years, especially when 6G comes around.
I wanted to say to your comment, just put something out there that the shutdowns were, of course, done on purpose, but I think one of the purposes behind it was to get kids and parents indoctrinated to having kids do the school online and in front of a computer and make that the norm. But I did have a question for you. So with all the research you did you happen to find an original source for this overreaching theme of the schooling that you were talking about? Did it go back to a certain source? Were you able to find?
Well, there's so many documents with so many quotes, like from the likes of John Dewey, and there's no quotes or books or documents that are explicitly saying we're going to dumb down the civilization so there'll be only workers. But there are quotations like the one that you guys shared in your podcast. Frederick Gates wrote in occasional paper number 1 from the General Education Board in 1911, I think. In our dream, we mold these people with perfect docility. They give them the benefit of the doubt. They're talking about very poor people just a couple decades after the Civil War. I can imagine very well-meaning, good people who would think, oh, that's a great idea. they're not going to be, let's face it, they're not going to be poets and world leaders. It reminds me of a friend of mine who is a really smart guy. He's a little bit of an elitist. And as he said, do you want the people at Walmart running the world? And I thought, I do, but I want those people as themselves not having already been conditioned for 10, 30, 40, 50, 60 years of their lives, right? Like, what if we had those people without that conditioning?
Are we actually asking the right question? And is it really, who do we want running the world, or who do I want to be in charge of my life? And I think that's part of the problem, is that we're not allowing people to live life, or how we view human beings on a philosophical level. And the point to Ken's presentation, I believe, is that he's shown throughout history how there is this tendency for a small majority to want to have control and rule over the masses. And so ultimately we have to ask ourselves, what is a human being, and what constitutes, a good human life? Personally, that is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And I've had to kind of come to my own conclusion, maybe not to drive myself insane, but like, I could raise a family, tend a garden, be virtually unknown, and live a fulfilling human life. So who is deciding who is valuable and who is not? And I believe really strongly that that's what we have to fight against, is this valuation of human life that decides who is worth it and who is not. So first of all, I think we have to ask the right question,
That reminds me of the essential workers, right? So Walmart was essential. You could go in there and buy flowers and buy eggs, but you couldn't go buy flowers or eggs from some small business person.
Just to punctuate that, one of the things that I did say in the lockdown was, yes, who decides who's essential? Because literally everyone is essential to put food on their children's table or their own table. So this idea that just pervaded throughout society, that we could somehow classify people as essential and non-essential, is horrific.
And I want to build on that a little bit. Going back to what you were talking about earlier in your presentation about eugenics, that really kind of underscores this idea, because the notion of eugenics is essentially one of a more powerful class developing essentially random criteria about who is essential and who is not. And it's taken to its logical extreme, where we literally prevent the existence of those who are considered non-essential based on those very arbitrary criteria. So related to that, what I also wanted to say is, Ken, we discussed on the radio a little bit a couple of weeks ago a point that I just want to reiterate for the benefit of the audience here, including the people who will watch this online later. And that is, since this is happening in a libertarian context, there's a small group of people right now who are really very visibly and actively trying to insinuate themselves into global politics, and that's the Silicon Valley technocrat billionaire class. And one of the things that we're seeing is they are, I think, very deceptively trying to brand themselves as libertarian. And what their trick is to basically simplify the idea of libertarianism to one that says, instead of the state running things, the private sector runs things. And that is extremely dangerous because what they are trying to do, in my view, is to get everyone on board to transferring power from the government so that it can be deconstructed into the billionaire private sector so that they can probably exert even more control than the government could in some ways. And one example of this is Javier Milei. And I've not been able to follow him as much as I would like to, but he's a hero to a lot of people because they see him as a libertarian, one of the first of his kind coming into head of state office and taking a wrecking ball to government. And one of the things that I understand he's done is do away with the Department of Education. But what does he want to replace that with? He wants to contract with Meta to provide Facebook online learning for the students of Argentina. What we would rather like to see is to go back to a more traditional form of education, imperfect though it might be, where students are able to actually self-actualize, get out, be a part of nature, or interact with nature, and do things of their own volition, rather than be locked into an online environment where everything will be dictated to them in the way that you've described. So I see this as a really dangerous trend, but one that I think is going to be accelerating going into the next several years, of getting all of this put into the hands of a few oligarchs in the private sector so we can do away with government, because they hate government. It's the interesting thing about technocracy. Technocrats despise government, but they want to go back to a Platonic model, because Plato described this model of a small group of ruling elites deciding everything for everyone. And that's kind of what we're looking at.
Yeah, well said.
Oh, I just wanted to mention something about what she was bringing up about who gets to choose and what they did when they said, okay, you stay home and these other people go to work. Well, see, that's conditioning us to accept a class system, saying that, well, certain people in our society, their job or function is more important than yours. Therefore, the rules that we're imposing on you don't apply to them. Just like we see with law enforcement and the judicial system, that the same rules aren't applied to them as are applied to us. Same with the politicians. It's just another example of conditioning us to accept a different class, a different treatment for, each person gets to have a different treatment.
I just have two comments. One is I spent my career in public libraries just because I could not be a teacher. I wanted to be in an environment where people were motivated to learn on their own and follow their own interests. But also, when I lived in LA, I did a temp job at this school called Crossroads, which is a very elite private school in LA. It's in Santa Monica. A lot of celebrities' kids go there. And I will tell you that their high school was like my private liberal arts college. Like, that is the way they were being taught. That's the kind of discussions they were having. Very different from like an average public school, for sure.
I grew up here in Tucson and in the school district, and I'm wondering if there's a value when a district puts special attention to the gifted kids. Tucson, TUSD had the GATE program for the gifted kids, and they would come to a central school or middle school or the high school, university high school. Is there a value in bringing the children of a community together to compete for the intellectual prize?
I guess it depends on, how that actually manifests. And to bring it back to John Taylor Gatto, his claim was that in his 30 years of teaching, like, the wealthiest and the poorest was, I've never met a learning disabled child. I've never met a gifted child. They're just different kinds of kids. So more generally, would it be of value if there were similar kinds of kids of whatever stripe together? And again, I would say it depends on the details. Another quote of his was, "Genius is as common as dirt," which I'm complete believer in from my experience with kids. But that's a good question. I don't know is my answer. What do you think?
Well, I'm kind of prejudiced in that my father was a founding member of University High School. And when University High School has evolved on a national scale, is one of the 10 best high schools in Tucson. I mean, in the country. Only this last year has it dropped way down. But for many years, it stayed that. And it seems to me that the accumulative students in the city of Tucson have benefited from bringing the best and the brightest to one place so that they can maybe push each other to beyond the limits of the traditional high school.
I don't disagree. Yeah, I'm biased because I want to blow the whole thing up, right? But I'm open to other ways of doing it, and that has potentially a lot of value. I promised you, if you asked, and even if you didn't ask, I'm going to share that quote from H.L. Mencken. Mencken was fact-checked, and he did, in fact, say, "As democracy is perfected, the office of the president represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire at last, and the White House will be occupied by a downright fool and a complete narcissistic moron." Yes. And it was 1920. And we all know who he's talking about. Yeah. We all know.
Thank you so much. Yeah. So I just thought I would make a final pitch. Yes, we are in libertarian land here and libertarian headquarters here in Pima County. I look around the room and we're all middle-aged or older, right? And I'm going to make a plea. You know, when Ken started talking about how, now he has skin in the game, it matters. If human flourishing matters to you, I need you to become involved. I know I hear it so many times, it makes me sick, and I try not to be sad and not, a little bit angry and maybe not a little bit sad. When I was homeschooling, I had other parents who would say things like, "I can't wait till my kids are 18 because, then I'm done with homeschooling." And I think, when are you ever done with homeschooling? Because I really believe that it's not the school, it's how we live life. And that was one of my favorite things that John Taylor Gatto had said, is that really what an education is learning how to live and how to die. That's the essence of being human, something that we are rapidly losing. And so if you're satisfied, just to be in your later years and say, "I'm off this planet very soon," okay. But if you're not, or if you value the children that are still being born today, who will not know any different unless you make a difference, I'm pleading with you. No, you don't have to join the Libertarian Party. And I'm so glad that Peter had mentioned that right now the Libertarian label is being branded in a way that is anything but libertarian. So I wanted to read from you from our platform why I'm here and why I feel like this is the appropriate place to stand if you believe in human flourishing. As libertarians, we seek a world of liberty, a world in which all individuals are sovereign over their own lives and are not forced to sacrifice their values for the benefit of others. We believe that respect for individual rights is the essential precondition for a free and prosperous world, that force and fraud must be banished from human relationships, and that only through freedom can peace and prosperity be realized. Consequently, we defend each person's right to engage in any activity that is peaceful and honest, and welcome the diversity that freedom brings. The world we seek to build is one where individuals are free to follow their own dreams and their own ways without interference from government or any authoritarian power. This is what matters to me. This is why I'm in the Libertarian Party. And I'd love to see much younger faces here. And I know the only way that that's going to happen is if you help me to make that happen. So if you're not already engaged in the Libertarian Party, please join me and please register as a Libertarian and help me that way. Thank you so much. And you may all get a book.
Thank you. I don't need it. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Ken, for giving us that wonderful history of education. And I didn't realize that this history of what is happening in our education system went back so far. So that was very eye-opening for me. I am the treasurer. See me before you leave if you feel so moved to donate to the party. And thank you again, Ken, so much. That I loved hearing all that history. And have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, Karen. Thank you.